So the pillars of support are groups or institutions that hold the current power structure in place. And the aim for social movements trying to create change is to remove one or more pillars so that the structure crumbles and comes crashing down. So let's do an example to see how that works in practice. Let's use a ruler of a country, could be a dictator or an elected leader. And in order to keep in power and keep calling the shots, a ruler needs a lot of groups on his side. You've got the bureaucracy, the media, the elites, the military. Um, for me, the pillars can sometimes feel invisible when they're standing. I feel they become more obvious when I imagine them taking their support away. So right now, it might not seem immediately obvious that the US military is supporting the current president. But when I think about the reverse, if the US military decided to remove their support from the current president and instead put it behind some, other presidential candidate who did not win the election, then I think we would indeed feel that the removal of that pillar rocking the stability of the whole structure. So to think about another example, maybe the militarized police at Standing Rock. For a military or a police force to unleash such brutality requires the support of the pillar as a whole, as well as the generals, the officers, the soldiers within that pillar. And that's a point that all these groups are made up of people, all these pillars. It's important because nameless institutions can feel impenetrable, but they all consist of people, and people can withdraw their support. And if they do that, the ruler cannot rule. So, I think we see this happening right now in Russia. There's the kind of pillars being chipped away at. I've seen army generals coming forward with criticism of the regime and the war. State media, protesting on air or resigning, and even possibly the kind of business community, the oligarchs starting to kind of pull their support away because of these sanctions. So, by visualizing all the pillars that prop up a system, we kind of open space to imagine how that system might be toppled. We can start to understand which are the load-bearing pillars, and which are the ones that feel more maybe breakable or accessible than others. So a classic example of this is the Otpor movement in Serbia. Now, Otpor means resistance in Serbian, and they were formed in, I think, 1999 in opposition to Slobodan Milosevic, who'd been the dictator there for 13 years. They were the leaders of this massive nonviolent struggle to overthrow this dictator, and they had, I think, more than 70,000 active members at its peak. And they're fascinating, and I've linked some more information about them in the notes below. Lots of the movement lessons that we teach today were really learned during that time in Serbia. But why I bring them up here is particularly how they use the pillars of support. So they did this analysis of what pillars needed to be removed and what pillars could be removed, and then built all their actions around chipping away at these pillars. So first of all was the independent media. And there were broadcast stations who started spreading information about the resistance, which gave Otpor kind of publicity, but also prestige. And these independent media were then sort of punished by the authorities with sanctions and censorship. But really what this did, it had the effect of alienating even the mainstream journalists. And so the more media were brought around to the resistance. Another pillar that fell early was entertainment and popular music. Like theater productions were raising their fists at the end of performances. And a third common early pillar is kind of intellectuals and university professors, along with students. And students were a really big part of the movement in Serbia. But the key was when students were brutalized in the streets at protests, which really led to the families of students who, were watching on TV or reading in the newspapers or just seeing their kids come home like bloody after a protest. And it really led to families starting to come out in the streets themselves. So you got mums and dads and grannies in solidarity and disgust at how their kids were being treated. And this really is an idea of a concept called the paradox of repression, which can happen sometimes that the worse repression gets, a dictator might want to crack down on protests to kind of nip it in the bud. But the worse the repression gets, the more outraged people can get, and the more likely they are to actually get involved in the resistance. But the last pillar to fall is maybe the most interesting. It's about the army and the police. So over time, through these protests, interacting with police and the army, and through kind of repeated arrests, the police got to know the protesters as mainly kids that wanted a peaceful change of a non-democratic regime. The protesters didn't go to protests with like a screw you attitude to soldiers and police. They weren't putting like flowers in their guns necessarily, but they did have open and frank conversations with them when they were interacting with police at protests. And gradually it kind of built some level of trust and understanding. And so when the time came and the police were ordered by the dictator to open fire on protesters, they almost entirely didn't. And many even actively switched sides to the protesters' side. So with Otpor, as often happens, kind of like chipping away at these pillars was slow and hard to see for a long time, even for the activists involved. But, the fall of the temple was quick. And so when Milosevic refused to accept the results of an election, all these different institutions, like much sturdier pillars, began to withdraw their support at a much faster pace. And then, and along with mass protests, it was only 6 days until Milosevic resigned. And then you see here this picture that 5 months later, after these events, he was arrested for war crimes and sent to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So, hell of an example. So let's do a more local example, a bit less massive, but possibly more tangible for us too, to take the example of Zenith Energy. So this is the company in Northwest Portland that is bringing in rail cars like you see here, full of Canadian tar sands oil, and then it exports them from their facility in Northwest Portland. If you've ever been up to kind of between Forest Park and the Willamette and south of St. John's Bridge, there's all those big tank farms and like docks and industrial zone. That's where this place is. And they bring in oil on rail cars and they export it onto ships down the Willamette and the Columbia. So think about the pillars of support. Take a moment to pause the video and think about what pillars you might think of that are supporting Zenith's operations, either directly or indirectly. Okay, did you pause? Okay, so here are a few of the different pillars that need to be on board with operations for Zenith to run. So you've got the railroad and the freight companies and their associated unions, the ship captains and companies and their unions. Like if either of those refuse to interact with Zenith, then Zenith operations could happen. You've got the government bodies that oversee the railroads, the rivers, the oceans, international trade. You've got the city of Portland that gives their necessary permits. You've got the workers themselves at the Zenith plant and their unions. You've got all the communities along the whole route, the whole rail route from Alberta, to here, and even beyond here, downriver. So you've got folks in Mosier in the gorge, where an oil train derailed and exploded and almost burnt a whole community down a few years ago. You've got indigenous communities along the routes. You've got here in Portland, schools and churches and houses and neighborhood associations all along where the trains run here in Portland. And those groups all have a say. It's a less tangible say than the city of Portland, but it's an important one. And if those groups are silent on the issue, it is indirectly supporting the company. So you also got the media by not making the kind of incredibly dangerous operation that's happening front page news. They're also indirectly supporting Zenith. And then you've got others, the list goes on. You've got buyers of the fuel downstream. You've got the banks that finance the company. And more. So our job as activists with this particular campaign is to map out the pillars of support in the way that we've done here, and then kind of assess which ones seem movable. So right now in this political climate, maybe railroad unions might not be the first to jump on board, but longshoremen, have a history of disrupting the shipping of fossil fuel projects. So maybe they get on board. Uh, the city council might be a good pillar because here in Portland, we kind of enjoy this reputation of Portland being a green city. I think that's the mayor and the commissioners like that reputation. But this dirty fossil fuel project threatens to, derail that image. So, once we've identified that, which pillars we want to work on removing, say it's the city council, we've got to make sure that the pressure on them to withdraw that support is greater than the pressure to keep the support in place. So we build a big, loud campaign that keeps this issue high on the list, makes it an electoral issue even. And we also show them that we've got their backs if they do pull the plug on Zenith.